everybody. Hello, and welcome to my presentation on Walt Whitman's piece of Vigil Strange, I Kept on the Field One Night. It was published originally in his book Drum Taps, which you can see the cover of there, top right. And just a little bit about myself in this lesson. I developed it while I was student teaching, and I've polished it up to flip it into an online lesson so that I can use it again, hopefully someday in my classrooms after I graduate. That's right, I am still in college. I'm a graduate student, a sixth year student, and I am working to end up with 2 masters, one in English education and one in English, so that hopefully I can teach at a community college someday after I graduate. So let's dig into this poem. First off, we're going to look at the poem and we're going to take some time to read through it, pause if you need, and then we're going to look at this vocabulary here. So, shouts out to the Poetry Foundation. I have used their website frequently and they do wonderful work putting good literary resources out for everyone to see. So, this is the poem. And I'll just pause for a moment here to allow everybody to read, and of course, if you need, pause it. Okay, and as we come back to the lesson here, I'll just scroll back to the top so we can cover the first vocabulary word, vigil. It's in the title, and I think it's important to consider what does a vigil look like today, when are they used, and the same for Walt Whitman's time. What would they have looked like in the this was published, I guess, in the year 1865, so just on the late side of the 1800s. What would make a vigil strange, as he calls it? Then I've got the words aloft and stole, which are just down here together, actually, in this line. And I think these are easy to misinterpret. It was for me, at least, when I read aloft, because I typically use that as an adjective to describe something's position as being relatively high up. But here it read almost as a verb to me, as if the stars themselves were lifting themselves up against the inky blackness of a night sky. And then also stole, I think, is easy to misinterpret, especially for some younger readers or some less experienced readers, because in contemporary times, when we use the word stole, typically it's used to refer to the crime of theft. Here, I think it hints at that notion, but what's more important is I think he's looking eastward and he's considering the position of the new stars appearing in the eastern part of the sky, sort of silently creeping across, stealing away that space from the other stars. And then I've also got the word enveloped, just because I think that use of the apostrophe, as you can see some other times in Whitman's work, here the word enveloped in this line, which I have listed, just because he's using that apostrophe instead of an E in the commonplace English that we see today just doesn't really ever call for that. And I think he's really only doing it just to save himself a syllable. So hopefully this sounded a little bit better when it was either read aloud or read silently to oneself. And then lastly, I've got Rude Doug. I just enjoyed this one because when I initially taught it, I got a little bit of a laugh out of it. So hopefully what I'm about to describe is a little bit novel to you as well. Here in this line, he describes depositing this young man in his grave, and he calls it a rude Doug grave. And I think today most contemporary readers might think that he was saying rude things or feeling rude about having to dig this grave, perhaps swearing as he was shoveling it out. No, I don't think that's the case here. I think Whitman meant this in more of a sense that this grave was relatively shallow, most likely, and also his family and loved ones were not there to lay him to rest. So I think that's what really he's saying is rude here. And then I want to take a look at these questions meant to help probe some of the initial meaning out for you guys. So I want to know if you can see any literary elements. I want to know if there's any personification or rhyming. I know I just mentioned one of those earlier in the videos. Or perhaps, can you identify the form or any interesting aspects about the construction of the poem? Can you identify if it's in sonnet, haiku, or free verse, for example? Those are important things to consider when you're trying to find the meaning within a poem, which can be tricky sometimes due to its unique form and word choice. So along those lines, I also love to ask my students when I look at poetry, what is your favorite line or most interesting, and which is the most confusing to you? Because often I think those lines are where we see the real inspiring parts of a poem. To help with your understanding of the piece, I've included some biographical and contextual information in the video. So first we'll start off with the fact that he was born in the spring of 1819 and died in the spring of 1892. An East Coast man through and through his life, basically. His poem here, A Vigil Strange, as it's called, was first published in 1865 in his book Drum Taps, like I said. But as you can see at the bottom of the slide, actually, he published 9 times during his career, and in particular, the ones listed in bold are the ones that earned him some of the renown that he experienced later in his life. He was a poet, essayist, journalist, and often referred to as the father of free verse. So that helps give you a hint as to some of the questions on the last slide. Then I've got his birth and death dates again here as it plays into the larger context of the time. Here in the middle paragraph, I've got 3 terms that are important to know when you consider the philosophy of these times, what people believed. These 3 philosophies or ways of looking at life were really important at this time, in particular humanism. And Whitman himself was a humanist, which meant that he held a philosophical stance that placed prime importance on the value and agency of human life. He was very focused in many ways on seeking solely rational ways of solving human problems. And there really was not a lot of focus on anything that you would consider spiritual or supernatural as we think of them today, or as people thought of them in this time. Then it's also important to consider that at the end of the 1700s, the United States gained its independence, and then it flourished for about 3/4 of a century until the Civil War, which tore the nation apart. It lasted from 1861 to 1865, which you may notice I've mentioned a few times that year 65 because that was the year in which this book, Drum Taps, was published with the poem that we're looking at today. So it's also important to keep in mind that at the time this poem was published, the average person's life expectancy was about 30 to 40 years. And at the time, in the year 1865, Whitman was 46 years old. So he was already sort of getting up there in age for his time, which is definitely different than how we would consider the age 46 in our current day. I've got some questions here at the end. These last 2 slides are meant to help you build a more concrete idea or understanding behind the poem and its meaning. So first off, it's important to consider things like who is the speaker, which if this was a story, we would call it a narrator, but since it's a poem, we would call it a speaker. Whitman and his use of the word I is talked about a lot in the academic community. It's a very interesting use of the role of the speaker. So do think in depth about that one in particular. Also, try and read for specific understanding, like try to understand who is the young man in the poem. Several times he refers to him as his son. Do you think he's actually a biological son or not? You can also pause the video at this time to take a few minutes and try and rewrite the poem in either of these ways here. Then we've got some further discussion questions. Another one here to get into some deeper understanding asks, when he says, I could not save you, do you think he really thinks he could have physically intervened and saved the young boy? Or does this seem like a more grandiose notion, like, oh, I could have saved you if I would have? Consider these questions carefully because they will be on the Google form that I'll have you fill out before you come to class. And once again, I just want to sign off by saying thank you for attending and paying attention to my lesson on Walt Whitman and his piece, A Vigil